Oh, hi! You caught me coloring in my original first print edition of Walking Dead. Speaking of ruining things, let's talk about the artist who ruined most of Jack Kirby's art.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Jack Kirby is remembered as Jack the King Kirby for a good reason. Over his many decades working in American comic books at Marvel and DC, he amassed a ton of fans because of his dynamic poses and his energetic layouts. But of course, even in his comics, he was never the only artist. In American comics, there's a bunch of artists that create the final product. Of course, there are colorists, there are letterers, and as we're going to talk about today, there are inkers. Now, the inker is somebody that will use ink to darken and embellish the penciled artwork so that it is made print ready. Some of the most popular inkers of Kirby's work include Joe Sinnott on Fantastic Four and Mike Royer on New Gods. But there's one artist who, while he had his fans, is considered by many to have absolutely ruined Jack Kirby's beautifully detailed work. That man was Vince Colletta, and today we're going to talk about the history and the techniques of this very controversial artist. And I encourage you, if you are ever going to watch a Comic Tropes all the way to the end, make it this one, because Vince Colletta flamed out in a spectacularly hilarious fashion. Vincente Colletta was born in Sicily in 1923, and according to family legend, Vince's father was a high-level mafioso who moved to America to escape law enforcement. The family followed a decade later, and Vince attended the New Jersey Academy of Fine Arts. He ultimately found his way into the world of comics in 1952. In 1952, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, previously best known for creating Captain America, launched the title Young Romance, and it birthed the popular genre called romance comics. The readership after World War II was older and less interested in superheroes. Romance comics became very popular in the early 1950s, and Colletta broke in as a penciler who inked his own work on titles like Intimate Love and Darling Love. The following year, he began working for Atlas Comics, the company that would eventually rename itself Marvel Comics. Vince's first confirmed work was My Love for You in Love Romances number 37. His work was strong, and he was noted for his delicate lines, realistic people and environments, and his lush eyelashes that he'd give to his women. By the late 50s, he was also illustrating romance comics for DC Comics like Falling in Love, or Charlton Comics like Love Diary. His last penciling job for decades was in Love Diary number 6 from 1959. Somewhere in this period, Colletta began inking the artwork of other artists. Exactly where is difficult to nail down. This was a time period where comic books didn't give published credits to the creators that were making them. So it's a little tough to nail down exactly when he started doing this. But what happened was Colletta realized that he could ink faster than he could pencil. And for him, it was all about the payday, not really the art. So he became an inker. Where exactly did he begin doing this? Historians guess that Coletta's first inking of another artist was on one of two books, either the cover of 1956's Annie Oakley Western Tales number 10 over Saul Brodsky's pencils, or 1958's My Own Romance number 65 over the pencils of Matt Baker. Neither is confirmed. However, the first time Colletta inked Jack Kirby is pretty much confirmed as the cover of Kid Colt Outlaw number 100 in 1961. He obtained the work because his work in romance comics was solid. He kept working on them into the 1970s. According to fellow inker Joe Sinnott, Colletta preferred the romance work, saying he liked anything that was quick. Superheroes took time. That, in a nutshell, is Vince's lasting reputation, whether you fall on the side of liking his artwork or finding it lacking. His contemporaries will all say the same thing. He was fast, and he had a reputation for cutting corners to get there. For Vince, it was all about the money. When it comes to inking, the artist will primarily use two tools: a brush, which can add line weight and depth, and pens or nibs, which can add fine detail and texture. Vince primarily used quill nibs. It allowed him to work faster. It served him well in some areas, like making hair look soft and flowing, giving delicate features to faces, and giving good textures to natural things like stone or wood or leather. That would all serve him well when he began inking Jack Kirby's Tales of Asgard stories in Journey into Mystery, beginning in 1964. He went on to ink the whole book by 1965 throughout Kirby's run on Thor that went into 1970. Jack Kirby was a prolific artist who would often have multiple books published in the same month, so he had many inkers. For comparison, take a look at how Joe Sinnott would add bold lines and thick shadows to bring out Kirby's unique line work, along with lots of technical detail. Mike Royer was slavishly loyal to Kirby's pencils, but was great at providing smooth lines and including lots of detail. Wally Wood would add delicate features and careful shading to ground Kirby's line work. And Bill Everett would bring a softness to characters' features, as well as incredibly detailed textures. There were many ways to emphasize Kirby's blocky work, or elaborate sci-fi machinery, or to ground it with more roundness and shading. Colletta certainly had fans, and he was a good fit on a title that was based more in nature as compared to a more sci-fi title. But any close look at his work reveals constant shortcuts. Shortcuts that do not serve to improve the story or improve Kirby's artwork, and are obviously just there to save Colletta time. One of his most frequent moves was removing characters in group scenes. He would just erase work that Jack Kirby did. These comparisons are photocopies of Kirby's pencils alongside the finished artwork that Colletta provided for print. For instance, in this scene from Thor number 154, Loki threatens innocent bystanders in New York, but when Colletta inked it, he dropped a person in the first panel and simplified the striped suit on the left. In the following panel, Colletta removed the man who had fallen to the ground, as well as the motion lines Kirby had included. This example comes from Thor number 144, which shows what Colletta would do whenever he had architecture to ink. It went from something elaborate and unique to nothing more than simple boxes. If Colletta had to include a figure for the story to make sense, but the figure was in the background, as in this panel from the same issue, the figure would be blacked out into silhouette. One of the most frustrating changes would be when Kirby created vast cosmic scenes, like this one in Thor number 152, showing Thor's home of Asgard. Kirby went to the trouble of illustrating both the curving rainbow bridge and many stars. Colletta didn't like to take the time to get circle templates or curve templates, so most of the stars just got blacked out. And the curving rainbow bridge lines have gaps and don't even line up properly. So you might find yourself asking, hey, if Colletta was omitting all these details, why was he still getting work? Well, a variety of reasons. First of all, Jack Kirby really didn't look at the finished published product. He didn't look at his own comics. He was always concerned with just getting on to the next issue. Then there was the fact that everyone, by all accounts, will say that Vince Colletta was a friendly, charming guy. People liked him, and so his editors were only too happy to keep giving him work. Finally, this was an era where you had to hit deadlines, and no matter how short notice they would give, Vince Colletta always hit his deadlines. Contemporary artist Alan Kupperberg spoke about Colletta, saying, Vinny understood that he was providing a service toward an end, and that end was not in creating art. That service was to meet a deadline so that the books could be printed, distributed, and sold on time and without penalty. And at that, Vince was the indispensable man. You can even see notes to that effect in the copies of artwork, like this cover for Thor number 148, where it reads, Vinny, Monday please? So for more than half a decade, Vince worked on all sorts of last-minute ink jobs for Marvel, as well as his regular gig on Thor. He could have taken the time to ink Kirby carefully, but he focused on speed and completed most of his inking work with his trademark scratchy and thin lines. It worked for Thor, but in 1966, he was assigned to Fantastic Four, and it didn't work at all. He lasted 4 issues and an annual that was the wedding of Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Girl. His style simplified the tech, which was what Fantastic Four was all about. Editor and scripter Stan Lee realized quickly that Colletta was not a good fit, and he removed him. He was followed by Joe Sinnott, who was a fantastic match. Just compare these two inkers' take on Galactus. While both have Jack Kirby's dynamic pencils behind them, if you look closely at the technology and machinery in Coletta's, it's very simple stuff, whereas Sinnott makes it look like it actually works. It's a little disappointing to go back and look at that very important wedding issue. This is a personal preference, but I never liked the way that Vince Colletta did eyes. He would basically illustrate them like a simple blank circle, and I feel like they sort of look like doll's eyes, or they're missing some humanity to them, and it really hurts to miss that humanity in an issue that really should be emotionally charged. The last of Coletta's strongest work before he really began phoning things in was arguably the 4-part Mangog storyline that ran from Thor number 154 through 157. After that, Marvel changed the dimensions of the paper they provided to artists, and Colletta never really recovered from it. From Marvel's beginnings through 1967, artists worked on artwork that was 12.5 inches by 18.5 inches, which was reproduced in comics that were roughly 6 by 9 inches. They used to call this artwork twice up or double up. In effect, it meant that everything was shrunk by about 50%, and therefore would print with slightly more detail than the original artwork. But artist Murphy Anderson, working on the Spectre at DC, wanted to work smaller. He kept the proportions the same and began working on art at 10 inches by 15 inches. The company Chemical Color Plate, which reproduced the artwork for both Marvel and DC, as well as a lot of syndicated newspaper strips, realized that with this size, they could use less film, less manpower, and less time. With these cost savings, DC mandated all artwork would be 10 by 15, and Marvel followed suit in 1967. It did not benefit Vince Colletta. Still, Vince Colletta hit his deadlines, and that counted for a lot. Colletta continued to freelance for Marvel, and in 1970, he also began working for DC. Jack Kirby had left Marvel on poor terms that year and began working for DC. Kirby was given 4 titles to write and illustrate, Jimmy Olsen, and 3 new books that would focus on his idea, The New Gods. Established pros like Frank Yakoya and Wally Wood asked the DC editors for the inking jobs, but ultimately the jobs were given to Colletta. At the time, Jack Kirby was commanding the highest pay rate in comics, and Colletta was willing to take close to the smallest. So from a budgetary standpoint, it made sense. But it was not his best work. It had some sloppy and splotchy line work on the first pages where we, the reader, got to meet new characters like Darkseid. Eventually, Kirby's assistants, like Mark Evanier, were able to convince Jack that Colletta was not making Kirby's art look good. But it took a little more than that argument for Jack to let Colletta go. Evanier showed Jack Kirby some of the finished printed artwork, and that opened Jack Kirby's eyes a lot, but it wasn't quite enough for him to let Vince Colletta go. Some of this is because Jack Kirby grew up in Depression-era America, and he didn't want to be responsible for taking away another man's income. What sealed his fate was that at the same time that Vince Colletta was inking Jack Kirby's artwork, he was freelancing at Marvel, and he would visit the Marvel offices, and he would actually show the new pages that Kirby was creating to the editors at Marvel. To Kirby, that was disloyal. And that was just a line too far. Except even then, he didn't completely fire Colletta. He had editor Carmine Infantino grant him permission to let Colletta go on all 3 New Gods titles, but allowed him to stay on Jimmy Olsen. During this period, Kirby seems to have simplified some of his backgrounds, perhaps now knowing that Colletta was unlikely to ink them. Kirby also began experimenting with photostat backgrounds, which probably thrilled Colletta since it meant there was less to ink. Even though Vince Colletta essentially got a demotion, he still had worked with Kirby on some important work, like the debut of The New Gods and Kirby's experimental 1971 crime anthology book, In the Days of the Mob. By the late 1970s, Colletta had established himself as the inker on Wonder Woman, and even accepted a position at DC as art director. By all accounts, this job was attained mostly by being a likable guy, but he refused to stop inking. There aren't many stories about Colletta contributing much to DC while he was art director. His biggest claim is discovering Frank Miller and giving him some of his first work. But there are an equal number of stories frustrated with Colletta's rushed work that he now had permission to give himself, like working on Mike Grell's Warlord series. Grell hated what Colletta turned his work into, but Colletta refused to give him a different inker unless he could get himself ahead by 3 months' worth of work, ahead of his deadlines, and so Grell did just that. By the early 1980s, Colletta had stepped down from his art director duties and was purely freelance inking, primarily at Marvel Comics, where he befriended the young new editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter. Someday I will do an episode about Jim Shooter. He did a lot for Marvel during his tenure as editor-in-chief, but he was also a divisive figure. And eventually he just went a little too far, rubbed some people the wrong way, and he got fired. But here's where Vince Colletta's career comes to a dramatic end as well, because if Colletta had a good quality, it was his loyalty. And he was tremendously loyal to Jim Shooter. So he penned a very angry letter to the other Marvel editors, chastising them for letting Jim Shooter go. It's basically a very crude and crass letter, so I thought I would class it up by having it read in a distinguished British accent. Thank you to my friend Harry Partridge. Let's hear some of that letter.
Marvel editors, you are the droppings of the creative world. You were destined to float in the cesspool till urine logged and finally sink to the bottom with the rest of the shit. But along came Jim Shooter, who rolled up his sleeves and rescued you.
Vince goes on for several paragraphs to argue about how great Jim Shooter was and how ungrateful the other Marvel employees were for all that he did for them.
Not the slightest whimper or cry or tear came out of this man. With you still biting at his ankles, he put on his coat and walked away, displaying more class and poise in defeat than all of you did in victory. Jesus had one Judas. Jim had many. Those that speared him, and worse, those that watched. I stuck by him, and for that you've nailed me on the same cross. I thank you for that. It's an honor to be crucified with Jim Shooter, a man who none of you will ever be. Vince Colletta.
Vince Colletta remains a divisive figure. He certainly did have his fans back in the day. During his Thor run, he seems to have gotten a bunch of fan mail. At the same time, a bunch, maybe most, of his contemporary artists did not want Vince Colletta going near them with his inks. They thought that it would ruin their hard work. A lot of artists would like to use a brush to ink because it can give things a more organic weight. The quill nib has its place, but for Vince Colletta, that was the primary tool. That's what he was known for. But you know what? He had his good qualities. He was, by all accounts, very friendly. He always hit his deadlines. If you'd like to learn more about Vince Colletta, I learned a lot with this book, The Thin Black Line by Robert L. Bryant Jr. If you'd like to hear maybe a more nuanced account, because this gives actual interviews from people that both liked his work as well as people that didn't, this offers that. It also has a lot more visual examples than what I was able to share with you in this relatively short video. So that's a book I'd recommend if you want to learn more about Vince Colletta. I would also say that if you want to be able to see his artwork as cleanly as possible, to look into the old Marvel Essentials reprints of things like Thor and maybe even Fantastic Four, because those were printed in black and white. There's no color in that. So you can really take a close look at his techniques. It is interesting, if you're at all interested in how an inker presents their work, those essential volumes are very valuable for looking at all sorts of inkers' techniques. Anyway, I often show fan art, but I'm doing a new thing where I'm only going to show it every time I've got 10 pieces. I'm not quite there yet, so probably next episode I will share some fan art with you. Until then, please, if you would be so kind as to hit like and subscribe, that really helps this channel. I do have things like a Patreon or Ko-fi if you want to support the channel. It really helps tremendously. January has been incredible. Thank you all for supporting this channel so much. Trust me, it's sincerely appreciated. I've got a lot of really cool big episodes coming up. So thank you for sticking with me, and until I see you next time, keep reading comics.